I'm Jason Miller from Videomaker.com, and this is your review of the new Sony a7S II. Sony has released the new a7S II really on the heels of the a7R II, which came out just a couple months ago and was really a spectacular camera. It had a lot of new features that we really dug. The only thing missing was the insane low light performance of the a7S. We were really hoping that the new a7S II would basically be the love child of the a7R II and the a7S, a 4K mirrorless camera with great image quality, fantastic focusing features, and built-in image stabilization, all with the ability to shoot in very low light. What we got isn't exactly that. While the Sony a7S II looks almost exactly like the a7R II, it's missing some of our favorite features. But more importantly, it's missing the logo on the front. It just says A7S. How will people know that I just dropped a ton of money on a brand new camera? Come on, Sony, can't you just play into my ego a little bit? Your cameras are tiny, and you can't tell one model from the other. Let's take a look at the camera itself. It looks almost exactly like the a7R II and very similar to the a7S. The new a7S II is thicker and heavier than its predecessor, the a7S, and has a really nice matte black finish like the a7R II. Also like the a7R II, it has several custom function buttons that you can program to be just about anything you want. You can even move the record button to someplace more logical than the side of the camera. You still have focus peaking and zebra stripes, a menu system that is more or less pretty easy to understand and use, a fantastic viewfinder, and an LCD display that pulls back and tilts. Though it would be great if the LCD did more than just tilt, like perhaps pull around and swivel. A really great feature that debuted on the a7R II is a 5-axis image stabilization system built right onto the sensor. Other than 4K, that was our favorite thing about the a7R II. The stabilization system in the new a7S II seems very similar, and that's fantastic. It works really, really well. I was able to walk around the streets of San Francisco with no tripod or support system, just the camera and some lenses, and still get some great footage. One of our biggest issues with these small cameras is that generally you need some sort of handheld rig or stabilization system when you're not locking off on a tripod. The a7S II, like the a7R II, is a really fun camera to use in almost any situation. One problem we noticed with the 5-axis image stabilizer is that it tries to stabilize the sensor even when you're using a slider or a dolly. We didn't notice this until we were going through our footage, but many of our slider shots had some subtle image warping due to that system. So just turn it off when using a slider or a dolly. The Sony a7S II has a 12.2 megapixel CMOS sensor very similar to the a7S. The image out of the a7S II is superb. It handles skin tones really nice in every picture profile, but especially using S-Log3. The image is super clean and very cinematic. There is a lot less noise than the a7S, in particular when you convert the 4K footage down to HD. The latitude out of the a7S II is amazing and incredible in S-Log. Just like the a7S, you get around 14 stops, which is awesome. These Sony Alpha cameras do an amazing job at retaining information in the highlights. There were many cases where we thought we were clipping the highlights, but there was still info there. This is a sensor that captures an incredible amount of detail, and normally that would mean more issues. But I'm super happy to report that we noticed no such issues. The Sony a7S II has the ability to record up to 120 frames per second, but unlike the a7S, you can do it in full HD, not just 720. But know this, the camera really crops the image for 120 frames a second, much more than the standard 35mm crop. Speaking of which, when recording in HD, you still have the ability to switch between full frame and Super 35, but that is not the case in 4K. Which is a bit unfortunate. A lot of people have complained about how noisy this camera is, and they're right. It is a bit noisy. That is unless you overexpose a little bit. Now, I know, with video you don't want to overexpose because you may clip your highlights. But because Sony does a great job at retaining the highlights in their alpha cameras, you can afford to overexpose just a little bit. So once you overexpose, that noise just disappears. Bring it into post, drop the blacks, add a little contrast, and what you're left with is a really beautiful image. That's how we have found to get the best image out of the A7S, the A7R2, and the A7S II. We really do love this sensor and the images it produces, but there are some real problems and annoyances. One of our biggest gripes with the image is that it's still 420 color sampling, just like that first 5D Mark II a half a decade ago. Now, you can capture 422 with an external recorder, but come on. Also, rolling shutter. Because it's got a rolling shutter, we have rolling shutter issues. So, for the time being, no movement from side to side. The biggest problem that we had though was banding. Anytime we shot the sky, we experienced banding, sometimes more than others, but it's a real problem. Hopefully, Sony will address this in a new firmware update, but for the time being, it's not good. This has nothing to do with the sensor, but it was a real disappointment. The focus ability of the A7S II is basically the same as the A7S, with the exception of facial recognition and a few other small features. We don't have that awesome focus tracking that was on the A7R II. We really wanted it on the A7S II. I guess Sony wants you to buy both cameras. There's been a lot of speculation about whether the new A7S II would have the same overheating problem as the A7R II. We wanted to find out how long it would take for the A7S II to overheat. We recorded 4K at 100 megabits per second until the unit overheated. We had to change the battery at about 45 minutes in. Then, at about an hour and 6 minutes in, the A7S II overheated. We kept the battery and memory card doors closed and the LCD screen close to the body. Overheating at just over an hour for 4K out of a really small camera, it's a problem, but it's not that bad. Let's talk about picture profiles a little. Now, the A7S II, like its predecessor, comes with a bunch of picture profiles. The A7S II comes with 9 pre-made profiles that you can then customize. And that is nothing new or exciting. Virtually all cameras come with some version of this. What has been super exciting though is that the Sony Alpha cameras come with S-Log. We're not going to get into exactly what that means, other than it refers to the gamma function and it mimics the logarithmic curve of high-end cinema cameras. S-Log is designed to be color graded in post. That's why the image is flat, meaning it lacks contrast and saturation, and is often referred to as a negative. These files need to be color graded to look presentable, but they give you so much more information to work with. Okay, now the moment you've probably been waiting for. Does the new Sony A7S II do as well in low light as the A7S? And the answer? Well, it's no surprise, it does better. The images are cleaner, sharper, and of course in glorious 4K, which means when you start cranking up that ISO and there's a bit more noise, if you down convert to HD, a lot of that noise disappears. We found the highest usable ISO was 102,400. Yeah, it was a bit noisy, and yeah, that's an absurd number. But it didn't look that bad. The ISO goes as high as 409,600, but really it's just kind of nasty looking. Everyone is obsessing over the low light performance of the A7S and the A7S II, but for the vast majority of us, this is something we shouldn't have to worry about. Low light capability is not a crutch. If you're a professional, then you are already lighting your shots and you take great care in doing so. Now, obviously for documentarians and ENGs, they often have to use whatever available light there is, and this camera's perfect for that. But for the rest of us, we should be a lot more impressed by the beautiful image this sensor produces rather than its ability to shoot in low light. Because really, it's a really cinematic image. The new Sony A7S II is a great follow-up to the A7S. It's hard to complain when you get a full-frame 4K sensor with 14 stops dynamic range that can shoot practically in the dark. It's not much of a stretch for Sony to call this a cinema camera. They have really taken the ability to shoot stunning images and put it in the hands of low-budget filmmakers. This camera is not without its faults though, and the banding issue is a really big one. But hopefully Sony will address this in the next firmware update. What do you think though? Is this the great follow-up to the A7S we were all hoping it would be? Or is it a disappointment? Answer in the comments below. To keep up with the latest video news and reviews, be sure to hit subscribe. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram @VideoMaker. I'm Jason Miller from Videomaker.com. Thank you for watching.